One of the most interesting things I've found about sports bettors and the research we found is they all think they win.
How has fantasy sports impacted sports?
I would say fantasy sports has really changed how fans watch sports, right? So, do you play fantasy sports?
I do occasionally. Like I'm kind of on again, off again with it.
Okay, so I mean, it's been around for a long time. It started in baseball, really started out with really hardcore nerds of baseball, but then in the late 90s, early 2000s, it really transformed into a popular cultural phenomenon where you had a lot of sports fans, primarily in football, that played. And it took the traditional fan of being, someone who's a fan of the Minnesota Vikings or New York Giants. And it took them from being a singular focus of just that team and maybe that team's rival to watching all of the NFL games because now they have players that play on the Arizona Cardinals and the Miami Dolphins. And because of that and their interest of those players, they're watching games on Thursday night and Saturday night sometimes, and Sunday and Monday, and on the holidays all over the place. And those interests go beyond just those players, but because of those players, they are competing against their best friends, they're competing against their family members. So it's pretty personal. And that interest, has taken a league that was already really popular and made it even more popular.
I'm a big numbers person. So like on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being the lowest, 10 being the highest. Like how big of an impact would you say fantasy sports has had?
Oh gosh, it depends on the league. I would say the NFL was already extremely popular when fantasy football took off, but I would say in terms of increasing its value and increasing the value of um, the media broadcast rights, I would say it's probably a six.
That's pretty high. That's higher than I thought that you would say necessarily. Why do you think that it's had that big of an impact?
I would say a lot of that has to do with the media broadcast rights and the importance of things of how fans watch games. I also think that at the time when fantasy sports took off, betting and sports betting was not legal. That doesn't mean that it wasn't happening. Sports betting um, is, I mean, the NFL in particular is really set up for sports betting. Though they play weekly, they're always showing the lines, they're always showing, um, you know, the different prop bets, everything associated with betting. But it wasn't, ubiquitous. You couldn't do it everywhere. You couldn't do it on your phone. But, fantasy sports, you could. And the number one revenue source for professional sports is media rights. It's the Fox Sports, the ABC, ESPN, it's NBC Sports. And those that play fantasy sports and those that bet, they watch games, they watch more games, and they watch games longer.
Is this the kind of thing that leagues knew what they were doing? Or did they kind of stumble upon this?
I think they may have stumbled upon the interest. I'm not sure they realized how important and impactful um, fantasy sports was to traditional sports fans. I'm not sure they could have predicted in 1995 how popular it would have become in 2009.
Yeah. Have they embraced it completely? Or have any
Oh
leagues
yeah.
kind of like, no, we're not doing this?
No, I think every league has. I think every league has completely embraced it. I think some leagues it's more popular than others. I use football as an example because it's kind of the gateway fantasy activity. I think if you play football, then all of a sudden it transitions to, oh, I'll try basketball because I like basketball. I'll try baseball because I like baseball.
What's kind of the dark side or the downside, whichever one of those you want to look at?
I think the one that I think popular culture has talked about is the dehumanization of players. I think, and we've studied this, we've done a couple of studies on the potential dehumanization of players. I think, Twitter and the dark side of social media has pointed out a number of bad instances where, and even I think the players have highlighted it too, especially the NFL players that have been, the ones that get injured, right? The players, they can't, they trust me, they don't want to get hurt either. But if you're, a highly sought after NFL player in fantasy sports, if you're a top tier running back or quarterback, and you get hurt in week one, the fantasy sports, population blames you for getting hurt. And they not only will they come after you on Twitter and on Instagram, they'll go after you in the stadium and they'll make comments like, you ruined my fantasy season. They're obnoxious. It turns out that's a small minority of the tens of millions that play fantasy sports. But that's one downside, is that intense connection to playing fantasy sports. We have found instances that the increased attention across the league has taken away from that favorite team fandom, right? So, who's your favorite NFL team if you have one?
Buffalo Bills.
All right.
And I say it
Well,
like that, right? It's hard to be a Buffalo Bills fan. I
it
love
is. There's a
them, but
couple.
it's hard.
Yeah, there's a couple of fan bases. And sorry to interrupt. There's a couple fan bases that have had a rough run, right? The Buffalo Bills, the Minnesota Vikings, right? And I always commend those fan bases because they stick with them. But yes, there's some research to suggest those that play fantasy, especially teams like the Bills, the Vikings, the Bengals, the Lions that have had tough seasons, that all of a sudden, as the season goes on or years go on without success, they then lose interest in their favorite team and just become fans of the league or fans of their fantasy team only.
How'd you get started looking in this? Like, why'd you decide to research fantasy sports?
I don't know if you know any fantasy football participants or anyone that plays fantasy sports. They're kind of like people who watch documentaries. And if you know anyone that watches a documentary, the first thing that they want to do is tell you all about it. Fantasy sports participants are the same thing. Like, all they want to do is tell you about their fantasy team. It doesn't matter if you have any positive feedback for them or reinforcement of nonverbals. They're going to tell you all about it. The bad luck they've had, the good luck, the scores, everything. And I realize, one, that's going to be really easy for me to do research on, because I'm going to have tons of research participants. Also, I also realize they're crazy. I lived in Los Angeles for 3 years when they had no NFL team. So everyone that I would go to a bar to watch NFL games was all people from Buffalo, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, you know, Washington, D.C. And they were all there to watch their favorite team and to watch their fantasy team. And I'd watch them every Sunday in this like conflict in their head of watching their favorite team and saying to themselves, and also watching their fantasy team and saying to themselves, all right, if this quarterback scores 2 touchdowns, but my favorite team also does this at the same time, I'll be good. And it was watching that irrationality that I was like, this is really weird.
I guess, what have you learned? Like, what would you say your big takeaways are from studying fantasy sports?
People play more for the social interaction than they do to win money, right? Everyone thinks that you play fantasy sports to win it costs you $100 to buy in. You could win, $800. You could win $600, but that's not why people play. They play to stay in contact with friends, to make new friends, to interact and with their friends. That's a primary reason people play. And that doesn't matter if you're male, female, that's the number one reason.
How did the players generally feel about it? Because I could see, like we kind of talked about, like, okay, Aaron Rodgers hates that he's getting yelled at because he got hurt, but then also somebody knows who the third running back on the Miami Dolphins is that they maybe wouldn't have other. So how did the players feel about it?
I think it's mixed. I would probably say I think some of the players are coached well by their teams and organizations to embrace it. I think they realize that it's beneficial to them and it's beneficial to the league. So they say, okay, I get it. We have to go along with it. I think there are some that truly despise it because they've had a bad experience. They've been chastised because they got hurt or they had a bad performance. They underperformed what their expectations were. There are also, NFL players and Major League Baseball players that play it. you know, there's the Austin Ecklers of the world that is a huge proponent. He plays for the Washington Commanders now. He used to be with the Los Angeles Chargers. He's one of the biggest proponents of the game.
Is there seem to be in your research? Is there a scientific rhyme and reason to winning at it, or is it ultimately kind of just a little bit of luck?
Fantasy football, I argue, is 65% luck. We ask fans that this in almost every survey that we do, like, what is your perception of luck to skill ratio? It's a perception, right? The more experienced a fantasy participant, the more aligned with that 60 to 70% luck. So, yes, the less experienced believe it's more skill because they believe the more time and energy you put into it. But the ones that are more experienced, they're like, yeah, I get it. Like, you can't predict who's going to, you're not going to predict who, the weather. You can't predict the referee. You can't predict your opponent. You can't predict so many aspects of it. When it boils down to it, we're playing a game within a game. And there are so many, we can't predict who's going to win one game, much less a game within a game. A daily fantasy sports game, like I say, a daily lineup game like basketball, hockey, baseball, where you make transactions every day because there's games on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, the skill does increase because there's just more variables to interact. I would argue baseball is closer to 35% luck, 65% skill, and then um, hockey and basketball are 50-50.
Is there a difference? Would you say that there's a difference between the type of person who does the NFL kind of weekly versus the daily stuff?
Yeah, there definitely is. I think the traditional sports fan and the ones that play fantasy sports are generally older. They are less um, avid sports fans. They have a less illusion of control of what's going on, right? Where those that play daily fantasy sports, they feel like they have some sort of inside information, right? They feel like they know more than other people. They have that illusion of control where, like, I have some inside information, or I know fantasy sports more than another person. They're generally younger, they're highly educated, they have more money. So they're the ones that play daily fantasy sports. But as I mentioned, as sports betting has taken off, and now we have 38 states in the District of Columbia that you're allowed to bet on sports, daily fantasy sports has died down in popularity.
Are you ready for some harder slash listener submitted questions?
Sure.
Sport that has embraced fantasy sports the most, sport that has kind of shied away from it.
Football has embraced it the most. I don't know if there's one that has shied away from it, but I will say one of the benefits to studying fantasy sports is I had to dive in. Well, a couple of different reasons. One is there's any sport on, I can always be like, it's research. But also, I got to try, or I tried a lot of different fantasy sports. I did, for some people that aren't huge sports fans, I tried a lot of different things. I did fantasy NASCAR, fantasy golf, fantasy bass fishing. I did fantasy Premier League. And my favorite that I did a couple of years ago was fantasy mushing, which
Oh yeah, the Diderot, that
is
kind of
is
stuff.
not just Iditarod. It is a
Oh,
7 race circuit of dog sledding. So yes, fantasy mushing is the low point of my. It used to be fantasy bass fishing was my low point, but fantasy mushing, which if you do a little bit of research, shockingly, you can pick the winner of the Iditarod.
what would you say has had a bigger impact on sports as a whole? Fantasy sports or sports betting?
Oh, sports betting.
Not even
Yeah,
close.
yeah. I mean, it's just been around so much longer. I think, um, yeah. I mean, especially as it relates to, yeah, I mean, you can go back to the scandals associated with sports betting, whether it's Pete Rose or the Black Sox with Chicago Black Sox to even the current ones we're dealing with now. Like, there are issues with the scandals, but also, you know, sports betting plays a role in favorites and underdogs and the stories associated with sports that I think sports betting is by far. Fantasy sports has been, it was a niche activity that was created in the, 70s, 80s, and it blew up in the late 90s, early 2000s, and is now part of popular culture, but it's nothing compared to sports betting.
Even if you looked at it just from like the last 20 years, it's still not even, it's still sports betting by a mile.
Yeah, I would say.
This one's going to be a tough one, man. Best team name you've ever heard.
Oh gosh, it's funny you brought that up because by winning my most important league, I have to name the team that got in last place for tomorrow. Because our draft is tomorrow, and so I have to name his team, and I'm going back and forth between what I should name him. This has got to be embarrassing or humiliating of what I should name him. There are so many good ones out there. I mean, obviously the trend is to use a player's name, but I mean, so many of them have inside jokes and that sort of stuff. The one that I like to use before, it isn't even that creative, but I always like was touchdown there, which sometimes takes a while for someone to get, but that's one of the reasons I like it. Uh,
now, okay. Yeah, touchdown there. Like, that's a good one. Does fantasy sports have a connection with betting? Is it like, the thing that always like, is it a gateway?
yeah, I mean, I do think there's always going to be a connection to it. I think there it is, especially with the transition from fantasy sports to daily fantasy sports. Yes, there is a potential gateway. We've never really studied longitudinally. That would be actually very interesting to look at, especially for age, because I think a lot of people they start with fantasy sports. Like the younger generation, like for instance, my son who's 10 just did his first fantasy football draft yesterday. I'm not going to lie. Part of me was like knowing his personality of like, what did I just do? Because, 15 years ago for a 10-year-old, there was no, sports betting on television all the time. Did I just start someone in fantasy football that is now going to be bombarded with sports betting that when he turns 18 in 8 years is going to all of a sudden have a huge interest in, putting money on uncontrollable outcomes. So we've never studied that longitudinal impact of starting in fantasy sports, but we have done research on how starting in fantasy football has impacted your interest in playing in other fantasy sports and daily fantasy sports. And that is certainly a case there. That if you start playing in one fantasy football league, the chance of you playing in other fantasy sports and then daily fantasy sports is certainly much higher. I do know the one thing that I really do like that I've heard as being a trend is that when a team wins, like a player wins their fantasy team championship, is that they donate a portion of their winnings to the team. There's always a player that carries you to your championship, right? There's, you know, let's say you won last year and it was Christian McCaffrey that was the guy that really drove you to the championship because he was amazing last year. Well, there's been a trend of taking 25% of your proceeds from winning your league and donating it to his charity.
That's pretty much all the questions I got. Is there anything you think that we missed or anything like that?
The only thing I would add is one of the most interesting things I've found about sports bettors in the research we found is they all think they win. Like they all have, and the phenomenon is called selective memory. It's a combination of selective memory and illusion of control. But the question we always ask is, at the end of the month, give us what your balance is from sports betting. Are you up $100? Are you down $100? And almost every single one is in the positive. Now we know that isn't the case, right? Like there's the reason Las Vegas looks the way that it is. I mean, there's a reason that these sports books survive is because they win the majority of the time. But according to the people that we surveyed, and this is thousands of people that we surveyed over years, they all, in their minds, they're because of selective memory, they only remember the good months or the wins that and this has been true from daily fantasy sports participants and sports bettors. They month to month only remember having positive outputs.
Why
So
would that be?
a lot of it has to do is they have a higher level of illusion control. These are individuals that believe that they are dictating what's happening week to week in the NFL. They believe that they know more than the traditional fan.
I may have missed it, but that's unique to sports gamblers as opposed to somebody who's gambling just like on poker or blackjack.
No, it's certainly not unique. It's as traditional non-sports better. So all of betting, whether you are blackjack or playing at a casino, the same thing happens. It's just we find it at a higher percentage in sports.